Okay, we're recording, so go ahead.
Hi, this is Fleet Maull, and this is your superior self.
I want to say thank you so much for joining the show, Dr. Maull. Um, this is truly a pleasure. I've read some of your content. Watched some of your videos. I think we're on the same wavelength, and thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
So why don't you go ahead and give us like a little bit of background, right? So I mean, your story is very unique. It's very different. You have your PhD, but you also have served time. Can you
Mhm.
kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, I'll try to give you the
I
thumbnail
know
sketch of it.
it's
So
pretty
it's
in
kind
depth.
of a long story, but I came of age in the '60s, and um, one of those baby boomers, and actually graduated from high school in 1968, which was a very, very tumultuous year in our country's history, kind of similar to what we're going through now, but even more so, really, with all of the assassinations, the Kent State killings, and at any rate, I was at that point kind of a classic angry young man, just stuff in my childhood, whatever, and I just went headlong into the counterculture of the time and just went off to a university and majored in drug, sex, and rock and roll and radical politics. And anything that would get the adrenaline pumping and that felt real, because I just completely lost. I felt so alienated to the world and the culture I was in, which was a process that started really early on in my childhood. It's just like I remember my early childhood being really magical, and then all of a sudden the magic went away and it just went to gray tones, and I never made peace with that. So I was always looking for something, and so I was a natural seeker and a spiritual seeker, but I got caught up in all that craziness as well, and eventually, just to kind of get out of the craziness, I left the country and became an expat traveling in South America, and again, just looking for something genuine, looking for something real. And I hadn't really been trained to do that. I've been trained to follow a program by my family. But if you do, if you stay on track, you'll be okay. If you don't, you're gonna be a bum or whatever. And of course, I wasn't following anybody's track, and I hadn't been trained not to do that. So it took me down a lot of twisted roads, like I think for a lot in my generation. And eventually, I did find my way into a very deep and genuine spiritual path with my first meditation teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, one of the great Tibetan masters to come to the West back in the '70s, and I went back to school and did a 3-year clinical training program in psychotherapy and counseling at a university that he started in Boulder, Colorado, called Naropa University. And but I still had all this shadow stuff going on that I hadn't managed to extricate myself from, and so I had this kind of crazy split life of spending about half the year in meditation retreats and traveling with my teacher and doing really sincerely deep work, and the other half of the year, going back to South America and being this smuggler and having this crazy lifestyle. And I knew the two didn't fit together, but I was kind of self-medicating around that cognitive dissonance, right? And so before I could untangle those pieces, I earned my way into a 14-year sabbatical in federal prison. I don't really mean to make light of it at all, because actually I was involved in something that was very harmful, and I have deep regrets about it. But I did. I am proud about what I did with that time. I was initially sentenced to 30 years with no parole, and I pretty much thought my life was over. The paper the next day said I'd be 65 before I'd have any chance of release, and so I pretty much thought it was over. And my son was 9 years old at the time, so I was absolutely devastated by what I'd done to him. I just really hit a wall, went through a complete dark night of the soul, and became radically dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life, and to really showing up and being of service. So I spent 14 years in a federal prison doing that, and it happened to be the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, which is the maximum security federal prison hospital. And this was the AIDS epidemic was just really taking off in 1985. And this was a place of just a hellish place of tremendous suffering. It was um, they had a forensic unit with about 400 psychiatric patients, many of them being grossly over medicated. They had, at least in my non-medical opinion, I'll say that to keep myself out of trouble. And they had about 600 medical patients who all came from the maximum security penitentiaries around the U.S., like Lewisburg and and Atlanta and Lompoc and so forth, and they were brought there for medical treatment, and so they were bringing all the AIDS patients there from these penitentiaries, and they had them isolated back in the psych ward for their own protection. It was just a crazy time, but I was in the right place at the right time with another inmate to start the first hospice program in a prison anywhere in the world, as far as we know, in 1987, and then I started an organization to take that model out into the world, and now there's probably, at least in this country, 75, 80 prison hospice programs in state and federal prisons. And so I spent that 14 years just really dedicated to service, to my own practice. I was literally practicing like my hair was on fire, I realized, it was really up. And, I had kind of ignored the ethical dimensions of my Buddhist tradition before that. I'd been focused more on awareness and the mind and all of that. And so I realized I had to really start honoring living based on the Buddhist precepts and dedicating myself to practice and to service. And I was just highly motivated. So it was kind of like my monastery time, although it was a kind of like a social action monastery or something, because I was
Mm.
leading a very disciplined life and, uh, uh, not connected to the outside world very much. And, in prison, you're all wearing the same clothes. They give you, you eat at the same, it's a very regimented lifestyle. Other than that, it's a completely insane place, basically. But I was able to make a life for myself there. And I taught school was my day job for 14 years and taught meditation and did 12-step work and did the hospice work and got out when I was almost 50 years old. And life's been just one opportunity after another ever since then. I'm very grateful for that.
Mm. Such an amazing story. Um, a lot of my questions that I have for you is just around that type of awareness, that meditative, I guess, lifestyle that you've created for yourself. I mean, you talk about the opposites, right? Like you're living that meditative, that awareness type of lifestyle, going to school, and then you're living the complete opposite. It's like the yin and the yang, like right there before you go to prison. Um, I mean, I just I mean, you had to be torn, like living both lifestyles, doing completely different things, and then going to prison for 14 years because of one of them. Did that need for service in prison come from the other side of you, the other half of you that was practicing that type of awareness, that type of meditative approach to life?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, before I went to prison, I had managed to compartmentalize my life. I just, which I think many people do, but anyway, I was particularly good at it. And there was certainly cognitive dissonance. I knew these parts of my life didn't fit together. I was actually, you know, wanted to get out, was trying to get out. I actually finally did quit. And, the proverbial last run is when things went south and I actually escaped the situation, but it later caught up with me. And other people I've been involved with also went on and continued smuggling. And then they got busted and decided to invite me to the party. So that's why I got a heavy sentence. I just, for my own ethical reasons, wouldn't cooperate against somebody else. I just couldn't see somebody else doing my time.
Mm,
So, like it or not, I ended up doing a lot of other people's time. And I got charged with the so-called kingpin statute, right? Which is they just, picking, in any kind of drug trafficking activity, there's a lot of people and everybody's all, there's a lot of different connections. You can just put a dot in the middle somewhere and connect a whole bunch of people and call that dot the kingpin, right? And so that was me, because I refused to testify against others, and others were more than willing to testify against me, it turned out. So I ended up with all this time, but I made a decision when I got there, because I realized the minute I got there, um, I spent 7 months during going through my trial and sentencing. I went to trial just because I really did not feel I was guilty of this so-called kingpin statute. I would have pled guilty to the rest of it and put myself at the mercy of the court, but I felt like I had to contest this one charge, but I ended up being convicted on it. And that was a hellish time for 7 months. When I got to the federal prison, it was kind of a relief, because here's this big place. You could move around. There was a workout room, there was a yard, I could get a job, it was a much different environment. But at the same time, I realized within a few days of being there that it was its own hell realm for so many people, because I was seeing men being wheeled around the place in wheelchairs, just emaciated from cancer and AIDS and other illnesses, liver disease, paraplegics, quadriplegics, men who were blind being, somebody helping them down a corridor. Can you imagine being in prison? Scary enough being in prison, but can you imagine being blind? And and so I was seeing all the it was when I first it really felt like a Fellini movie or something, just grotesque suffering. And that really shook me out of the as you can imagine, I was pretty caught up in my own drama at that moment. I'd gotten this 30-year no parole sentence. I thought my life was pretty much over as I'd known it. I just completely had really torched my own life. I felt like I'd, just so devastatingly had, hurt my family and let my teacher down, my community. And so I was very much caught up in that drama. And then I hit this place and it just shook me out of that. And I just immediately started trying to figure out how can I show up and be of service here and continue my own training. And that was largely, or well, it was many influences. I mean, I grew up with a good family. We had our issues. There was alcoholism in the family. And, so that created this whole shadow thing in the family. I'm sure led to a lot of my issues. But apart from that, it was basically a good middle class family, and I got a lot of good values from my family. And but my spiritual teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, as far as I could see, and I watched him pretty closely. I'm from Missouri, so the show me state. So I was a natural skeptic, and all I could ever see that 24/7, he was living in service of humanity, just living in service of helping others awaken. And so he was kind of like right there on my shoulder, and I don't think I could have done any less than just show up and serve in that place. And there was a lot of suffering, so it just kind of came quite naturally. And the other thing that I saw was that the culture in that prison, even among the general population inmates that I was part of, there was about 300 of us there who were just there to help run the place, work in food service or housekeeping or the welding shop or what have you. And I taught school. That was my day job for 14 years, helping other prisoners learn to read or get their GED or learn English and so forth. And so it was a world of culture among the inmate population, the prisoners, was just one of tremendous bitterness and anger. And everybody had a victim story. And it was like this ritual. When you met somebody, usually, you'd take a walk on the yard and then, they'd tell you their victim story and then you tell them your victim story, right? It was like the ritual, my ball partner screwed me over, my lawyer, this, that. And, after I went through that ritual one or two times, I really didn't want any more of that at all. I didn't want to hear my own story. I didn't want to hear their story, which wasn't very compassionate, but I didn't want to live that way. I certainly didn't want to come out of prison if I was lucky enough to survive that time, anger and angry and bitter with a big victim story. And I really didn't want to live that way in prison. I'd had enough training and influence from my Dharma path. Thank goodness for that. So I realized that the only way through and out, if I was ever going to get out, was to embrace 100% ownership for having got myself into that. I mean, there was lots of people I could blame, all the people that kind of stuck me in the back, and the government, when they prosecute, they break all their own rules. They do everything illegal. I mean, they play hardball, right? And so there have been lots, I could add all kinds of stories going. And I just decided to make a clean boundary with that. I just cleave that right off. And I'm going to focus on one and one only thing: how I got myself out here, in here, and how I'm going to get myself through this and out in a
Mm.
good way. And that's really where the model I eventually started calling radical responsibility came from.
Radical responsibility. Just taking complete ownership of what it is. I don't even know the patience that you had to have to, like, for yourself, right? That forgiveness of yourself for being in there and then being in the moment. Like 14 years is a long time to be in a place like that, especially where they basically tell you what to do uh, every hour of your day. Thank God for meditation, right? Like being able to be in the
Absolutely.
moment, right? So talk
Yeah.
about that. Like when you're, I'm assuming you're like in your, if you did 14 years, you're probably in mid 30s. What, when did you become introduced to meditation and when did it like, change your life?
I actually got interested in Buddhism early on. I was raised Catholic and I had a good education. I went to a Jesuit prep school, if you will, a high school. And Jesuits are good educators. And it was in a comparative religion class, my sophomore year, that I read some Buddhist texts and some Hindu texts, kind of traditional scriptures. And it was the first time I'd read anything that really made any sense to me. I'd kind of lost my Catholic faith early on. And, today I really appreciate all our great religious traditions in lots of ways. But the kind of catechismal pre-Vatican II theology that was being presented to us
Mhm,
back
mhm.
then, I just had never connected with that ever, really. Even if I remember in kindergarten thinking, ah. And so, I didn't connect with that. And so I read these things. It was the first thing I connected with. And then I think that same year, somebody gave me a book called uh, Zen and the Art of Archery by Herigel, a German who spent a long time living in Japan and got involved in the discipline of Kyudo or Zen archery, which had both a Shinto and a Buddhist background to it. And it's basically in learning that discipline of Zen archery or Kyudo, you're really right up against the wall of your own ego. And it's a whole deconstructive and transformational process. So when I read that book, I remember realizing, oh, I'm a Buddhist. I get it. And that was the summer after my sophomore year in high school. Now, this was Missouri. There weren't a lot of other people interested in that kind of thing. When I went off to college, a little bit here and there. Um, but there weren't a lot of avenues for me to continue my interest. And when I left and was traveling in South America, meeting other travelers on the road, I, started learning a lot more. And eventually I zeroed in on Tibetan Buddhism and the only 4 or 5 books that were available at that time. Now there's probably thousands, but there were like the Evans Wentz books were. So I was, living high up in the Andes Mountains in Peru with my books, trying to meditate on my own. I also had a little book called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which was a Taoist text with the forward. What the forward was by Carl Jung, the depth psychologist, and trying to figure out how to practice on my own. And I wasn't getting very far. It was hit and miss, and but then travelers showed up down there. And I lived in a very remote place, but people would find us, and some people showed up and stayed with us for a few days, and they had a copy of Rolling Stone magazine from I think the early fall of 1974, which had this big feature story spread about the founding summer of then Naropa Institute, now Naropa University, with Trungpa Rinpoche there, Ram Dass there. And I saw this and I just knew I had to go. In fact, I saw Trungpa Rinpoche's name and it just kind of grabbed me. I knew I had to go there. And so I eventually found a way to get back to the States and enrolled in a master's in, then it was called Buddhist and Western Psychology. It's now called Contemplative Psychotherapy. But I enrolled in that program mostly not that I wanted to become a psychologist particularly, although that had been one of my majors in undergraduate school, but it was because that program had the most meditation in it. That's what I was interested in. So I managed to go there and sadly I funded my way through with part-time drug smuggling. I would disappear once, twice a year and do that. But I got through graduate school and through the process connected with this tradition and with my teacher and so that's how that was like so that began in my late 20s. So by the time I went to prison, I'd been training and practicing pretty deeply for about 10 years, although at the same time compartmentalizing it, not really applying it fully to my life until it wasn't really till I went to prison that the compartmentalization stopped and I really totally embraced the path.
Yeah, because your other life was no more, right? Like, you
Yeah.
had no other choice but to be all of that. Um, how did you said you went and met your spiritual teacher, like, how did that relationship, like, come about? You went and sought him out, and then how did you introduce yourself? Did you have to, like, prove to him that you would be a student? Was he like, "All right, I'll be your mentor?" Like, what did that look like?
Well, he already had a lot of students at that time. I mean, he came he escaped Tibet in the 1950s when the communists overtook Tibet, and then he was India, and then eventually he was studying at Oxford, and then he came to the U.S. I think in 1970. And so when I got to Naropa University, it was 1977. So, he'd been in the US and developing and it just they started their own school. So they already had quite a thing going. And he had a major center in Vermont as well as the center there in Colorado and small centers already all over the country. So he had a lot of students. And so I was going to the university that he founded. And actually, he was the first year I was at school, he was on retreat. So I didn't meet him until I'd been there a year. And during the summer sessions, he would teach this big class, 300 or 400 people would go and once a week. And so that's the first time I saw him was going to that class. And I remember meeting him on the way out. He stopped, I happened to be by the door. He said hello, asked me where I was from and so forth. But a ways down the road, I had a meditation instructor. I'd become part of that community, and everybody has a meditation. So I had another senior student who was my meditation instructor. And at one point, he said, you really need to connect with Trungpa Rinpoche on a more personal level. And I said, well, how do you do that? He's got lots of what I go knock on his door and say, hey, I want to connect with you. He said, I don't know, but you got to connect with it. So there was ways to participate in the service of his household, was one way to get connected. So I did that, and eventually I met him and got, for whatever karmic reason, I don't know why, he kind of immediately drew me into his world, and I got close to him kind of quickly and became one of his personal attendants, and would travel with him, and spend a lot. I would do shifts over there. There were a number of us that did that, so once or twice a week I would spend 24 hours on duty with him, kind of helping facilitate his. I mean, he was this Renaissance figure. He had students all over the country. He knew a lot of the iconic famous people of that era knew him. I mean, he was a real, the poet Ginsberg, and Dylan, and many people knew and connected with him. Trungpa Rinpoche was like this major iconic figure of the spiritual scene of the 1970s and 80s in the US. So he had a big thing going on. So I was one of the people who would help facilitate that. And then when he traveled, I would often go on the road with him, and I just kept this whole other world secret.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I actually realized that I was going to be indicted, that I went to him and revealed to him that I'd had this going all the time, and expressed my regret about it and asked him what to do. I actually asked him at that time whether this was some kind of, at that time, the whole drug war phenomena, and this was when Reagan was president. And I said, is this some cultural thing I should just escape and, go to live in a monastery in India or something, or do I need to stay and face this, or what should I do? And I didn't ask him that directly. He was in Canada. I had a friend of mine that had a similar relationship go, and who was up there, ask him. And from what I hear, he sat with it for 4 or 5 days, and then the word came back. He said, you should stay and face it.
Mm.
And he said, if you're on the run, it's going to be very hard for you to continue a Dharma path or continue to be my student. But even if they put you in prison for 20, 30 years, you can still practice, and we can still work together.
Mm.
And so I did. I turned myself in when I was indicted. That was actually about the first time I ever took anybody's advice. And I've never regretted it.
Well, I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? Like, so if you're that good at meditation and that good at working on your dharma, I mean, are you really in prison? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like you can be like meditation takes you to a place. I know it takes me to a place that is outside of this consciousness, that is outside of this realm, this form, this reality of form, right? Like, I feel like I can lift that veil a bit, but in prison, I feel like you could do that if you are that good at meditation. I mean,
Well,
could you do that?
our approach to meditation really isn't about getting outside of the world. It's about getting more into the world.
Hmm.
It's about being fully present and fully aware. And it does help us unhook from our neurotic connection to the world, our fear-based, insecure, neurotic, fixated connection to the world. But it's really about being more present and feeling more intensely. So for me, yes, I remember actually in one time looking out uh, the window from my cell in prison, and there were these internal yards that I could see from there. Nobody went to. They were fenced off. They weren't the yard that you could go out and walk on and so forth. It was just kind of empty space between buildings and so forth. And I looked in there, and I saw there were all these rabbits coming and going, and I thought, wow, they're running around playing, and I think I've seen that in other correctional environments. I think they tend to go there because other predators can't get inside. Somehow they get under the fence, but the other predators can't get at them, right? So at any rate, I'm looking at these rabbits, they don't even realize they're in prison, right? And then, when I would get out on the main yard, they'd had 21 trees and had some flowers, and it was kind of life-saving, and you could walk this track, and they had a softball field and a basketball court and a bocce court and things like that. And, I spent as much time on the yard as I was able to. And the birds would be there, and I look at the birds coming and going, roosting in the trees. They don't realize they're in prison either. So that, kind of a cognitive reframing that helped me realize that the whole thing about prison, not prison, is somewhat a state of mind.
Sure.
But at the same time, I don't want to be too transcendental about that, because prison is
Mm-hmm.
a hellish environment.
Sure.
I mean, there isn't a day that goes by that you don't end up having at least a half dozen, if not many more encounters, either with the correctional officers or your fellow prisoners, that are incredibly demeaning, just
Mm.
incredibly dehumanizing and demeaning. So it's really an awful place. And I want to be clear that I've had many people interview me over the years, and sometimes they say, well, prison seemed to have really worked for you. And in some ways, it was an ideal place for my journey of transformation. But for most prisoners, it's not. They come out worse than they went in. It's a very dehumanizing, debilitating environment. I was lucky. I went in with a lot of strengths. I went
Mm-hmm.
in with a lot of training, a lot of practice, and a lot of strengths. So I was able to turn that into kind of my transformational practice place and monastery of sorts. But that's very difficult to do. So, but at the same time, I was really practicing very, very intensely, and I eventually managed to kind of one place where practice became really real for me, because I had so many experiences around my teacher that were just really, transformative experiences, and experiences of being in a very free state of mind, and a very kind of open,
Like an all being, like all oneness kind of state.
those kind of states, but just very powerful states. But a lot of it had to do with being around him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was always telling us, that don't, the I didn't hang around me, get some contact. I go do the work. You're supposed, do the work yourself. So you have this to give to others. And I'd also had in retreat, I'd had powerful meditative experiences and so forth. But it was sitting there and doing my practice in my cell in that prison when I started to have these profound experiences there, where there was nothing to support that. And I was experiencing myself in a state of joy here in this prison cell, in a place where there was nothing to be joyful about. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when I realized, oh, this stuff's really real. And, it wasn't like I walked around in prison blissed out, but I was in a basically positive, cheerful state of mind most of the time, almost all the time, which was weird. And I didn't really tell people that, or that I might have gotten locked up in the psych ward, right? But I was able to do that in prison. And it was an interesting place to live, because it is so intense. It's so overcrowded. I lived on a unit, a general population unit, on a floor that was originally a medical floor designed for 50 patients. And we usually had 180 to 185 men living on that floor, just packed in like sardines. No air conditioning in the summer in Southwest Missouri. And very intense environment, a fight waiting around every corner, and just a very intense environment. And it was just in your face all the time. And so you were acutely aware of your state of mind. Like, if you weren't if your mind wasn't really settled, you were going to be profoundly irritated a lot of the time, right? And anytime I came out of my cell into that craziness, I could tell right away where my state of mind, my practice was at, because I was here like, oh, interesting. Look at all that energy, or And so in some ways, it was a great place to practice. It's not that I would wish it for anyone, but for me, it ended up being a very powerful place to practice all those years.
I can only imagine. And being in a cell, you don't have the luxury of having like, guided meditation with headsets or anything like that. I'm sure you had to do it old style with the counting of the breaths. Is that how you did your meditation? Like
I
being,
do counting breath practice, but that's not the only style. But basically, mindfulness of body, mindfulness of breathing, and using a variety of techniques. And I was also, I practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so there's a lot of inner yogic practices as well. But the foundational training is basically training your mind, mindfulness of body, mindfulness of breath. You focus your mind on the body and the breath. When the mind wanders, you bring it back. Wanders again, you bring it back again. And in that way, you train your mind, and you're able to stabilize your attention, and then gain access to innate qualities of awareness.
mm.
Mhm.
What has been you described it a little bit, but like what has been the biggest, I guess, like most extraordinary experience while meditating that you've had?
Well, I don't know. I don't like to get into that too much. I'd say, you know, the the more what I will say about that is is when it's the absence of the sense of me.
Mm,
When it's a quality of being that's not self-referenced to me or I or what I'm experiencing. So they're almost like non-experiences. They're supposed to being big deal experiences. They're like non-experiences. But that's a tremendously liberating experience to not have that constant self-preoccupation
yeah.
going. So when that falls away, it's just like a big
I'm
relief.
so trying to get there too. Like I feel like the '70s were very instrumental in this consciousness game. Like, you talked about Ram Dass, Robert Monroe, right? Like you talk. I mean, there's so many key players that came out of that era. I just feel like I'm reading a lot of their texts, and Bob Monroe had Hemisync. Ram Dass did LSD. Um, I don't know. I'm trying to find that for myself, right? Like I'm trying to get into different meditative states and find that oneness and experience that, because like the way or the how they're explaining that, the way that you're explaining that, right? Like that I just feel like that's the game of it. But the problem is like coming back to reality and feeling that struggle and feeling that suffering, right? Like I feel like Ram Dass, I've been reading a lot of his stuff lately, and like he talks about the name of the game being free, and free is being able to have that suffering but be human, right? Like knowing, being on that line of blissed out and suffering, but being in the middle and being able to see the entire picture and live your life in the moment, and and enjoy the moment for what it is. Like don't worry about 3 weeks from now, be here right now. And it's just it's I don't know, I'm still learning, I'm very early in my
Yeah.
journey. um what are some what's some advice that you would give me in that?
Well, at least according to my tradition, in basic and it's common across the various Buddhist traditions, whether it's Zen or Tibetan Buddhism or Vipassana or different Buddhist traditions, and it's true in other contemplative traditions as well. I mean, we often have this idea there's somewhere to get to, there's some particular meditative state to have, and those notions are actually counterproductive because there isn't anywhere to get to, and there isn't any particular meditative state to have, and as long as we keep looking for that, we're just going to continue to make ourselves unhappy. And it's really in an ultimate sense we're already there, but we don't realize it.
Mm,
So it's really about meditation is more of it's training the mind to begin with. There's no getting what you have to train your mind to be present, right? Because we are so lost in our constant chatter of our brain, right? And even we understand now in neurobiological terms that we're training ourselves to make the shift from what's called the default mode network of the brain, which is a set of neural pathways in the brain that's active when we don't direct our attention. And that's the noisy chatterbox monkey mind part of our brain. And then when we engage something and we focus, then we engage what's called the task positive network, which is stabilizes our attention. And those two neural networks, the default mode network and the task positive network, are mutually inhibitory. So the extent that we engage, I mean, we all know, like if you're really trying to thread a needle or bait a hook, or you're focusing on returning a serve or hitting a fastball, you're not thinking. If you are, you're gonna strike out, right? So when we can focus, the mind quiets down and we're actually making a shift from one set of neural networks to the other. So we have to train our mind to be focused. That's job one. We have to train the mind to be able to focus and be attentive. And then it's really just a process of being with our experience and letting all the junk that's in there that we've accumulated, just letting all that move through and unaccumulate and fall away. And it's more about what we let go of. And it's really also, but we let go of it not by wanting to get rid of it, by being willing to feel it. It's the willingness to actually be with our experience moment to moment, whatever it is, whether it's suffering, whether it's sadness, whether it's joy, whether it's anger, whether it's fear. It's the willingness to just be with it. And we have to train our mind to do that and open our heart to do that. But we're training ourselves as human beings to be fully alive in the world with our heart wide open, experiencing both the joy and pain of being alive as a human being. And there's no escape. Often people get the idea that the spiritual path is some kind of transcendental escape, but it's not. It's actually going deeper into our humanity.
deeper into the humanity. How do you have an open heart in prison though? Like that's the thing. Like how do you love? Like, how do you love any person that is in that like you were talking about, describing
Well,
it, right? Like,
yeah, well, the word love might be a little loaded, but depending on how we use it,
we
but
know, open heart, you know what I
just
mean?
being open-hearted, right?
Yeah,
And so when I was in prison, what most prisoners do, quite probably rationally in a sense, is they really try to shut down and numb themselves out because they don't want to be there, and they just want their time to go by, and they want to just sleepwalk through it if they can. So they're very often, unless they're kind of out of control and got a lot of problems, and then they're usually in all kinds of struggles in prison. But if they have their act together at all, they just get a routine going. They go to work, they work out, they have this routine, and you just kind of get into your routine and you just get numbed out. And I met a lot of prisoners who didn't even like to have visits very much because you go spend a day in the visiting room with your family or your wife or your kids, and suddenly it opens you wide open again. You go back into the prison and you're suffering again. And it takes you a week to get yourself numbed out again, right? And of course, I'd had enough training, fortunately, and I didn't want to live that way. And originally I thought I was going to be in 30 years. So I figured out how the system worked. And you used to get a lot of good time if you stayed out of trouble. So eventually I learned uh, that, if I stayed out of trouble, that I would do the time I did, which ended up being 14 years. But it was still a really long time, and I couldn't just throw away that much of my life. So I wanted to, I liked having visits because it did open me up, and I really wanted to be alive and open. I mean, I was serious about practice at that point. So I took care of myself as well. It's not about being reckless. It's not, prison's a very dangerous place. And I learned, fortunately, pretty early on how to carry myself in there. Because if you carry yourself too passively or too weakly, you're going to attract predators. And if you carry yourself belligerently, you're going to attract challengers. But if you're aware and you're kind of self-contained and you're respectful to other people, you avoid most of the BS, right? I mean, in 14 years, I probably got into about, I don't know, 6 beefs that were potentially very dangerous. One really could have gotten extremely dangerous. But I probably avoided 10,000 of them.
sure.
you know, so that's pretty good in 14 years. And that was just basically through mindfulness and awareness and learning how to carry myself. But I also, the other thing that happened to me, there were always I had, so I'd have, I would keep myself very busy in prison. So I wasn't looking to hang out. But
Mhm.
eventually I'd always attract some people, and I'd have a small crew or buddies or something that we'd hang out, or we'd go out in the yard and shoot baskets or something. And of course, most people were only at that prison for a year and a half. And so I went through, a number of those groups of friends over the years, quite a few. And so at one point, I had these 2 or 3 guys I was hanging out with for a while, and they had got this thing going. I participated in it, probably not the best thing, but we all kind of kept this top 5 list of who we thought were like the most despicable, human beings on the unit with us that made everybody's life entirely miserable, right? And of course, it was coming out of their own misery, but I mean, there are people among your fellow prisoners that just they seem dedicated 24/7 to make, they're obviously very unhappy and they want to make everybody else miserable too. And I mean, until you go to prison, you can't, I mean, you
Yeah.
have no idea what inconsiderate or unconscious behavior is until you go to a prison. And and so we compare this, and like we'd be walking down, somebody say, "Oh yeah, so and so's like he's one on my list," and I might say, he's only like 4 on my list. That's nothing. You see, and somehow the guys that would be on those lists would always somehow worm their way into my life. They would end up being one of my students at the school,
Mm,
or I don't know, somehow they'd always get through the cracks of my armor. And it wasn't like we necessarily, they didn't change, but it was like I couldn't reject them anymore. I couldn't
sure.
reject their humanity, right? And so it was just kind of like that. If you're open to it, and in some ways prison can be an incredible, for me it was, I think, an incredibly humanizing place,
Mhm.
although that was clearly only because of the context I held and the practice I had. Otherwise it's an incredibly dehumanizing place.
What are some of the transitions that you saw in those prisoners that came to you? Like, those people that were on those lists and then you started teaching them, like, obviously there had to have been some, tremendous transitions.
Well, the guys I was referencing weren't people that necessarily that I was teaching, or that really, I mean, I was teaching them in school, maybe, to get their GED, but they weren't guys that were really, it's not that they changed. Some of them remained just as obnoxious as they were. It's just that I couldn't reject them anymore
Mm,
because somehow I'd seen their humanity. I'd seen them, on the phone crying because their wife was taking their kids
sure.
away, or I'd seen some part of their humanity, and I just could no longer reject them. Yeah.
Yeah, the humanity in it, right? Like it's seeing yourself in other people. Like even people that just like you were talking about, the people on your list that just get under your skin, that just find ways to make your life hell. But it's seeing the humanness in them, seeing that it's like a mirror almost, right? Like you're seeing the things that you don't like about yourself and other people.
Well, that's one of the great insights of Western psychology is that which bothers us in other people is the best mirror into our own stuff because it's very hard to see our own stuff. If it didn't have some connection to our own stuff, it wouldn't bother us so much. So if it's something that really pushes our buttons, then there's information for us there. Absolutely.
Mm,
One of the things we might touch on, I mean, for your listeners, just the kind of irony of things, so I spent 14 years in a maximum security prison and I got out. I was almost 50 when I got out. That was 21 years ago or going on 22 years ago. And, I had a serious criminal record. And, today, what do I spend a great deal of my time doing? Today, I spend a great deal of my time training correctional officers and training police and other law enforcement and probation and parole officers in mindfulness and emotional intelligence. So how's that for irony, and how's that for,
that is kind of
you know,
crazy.
blowing our minds about what's possible?
Do they get the idea of emotional intelligence, like being able to turn the brain in on itself and seeing how the body reacts?
What's your question about that?
So, like, is it hard? Like, is it hard? How do you? I guess I guess it's not a hard concept to understand, but how do you teach that to people that never heard about emotional intelligence?
Well, I use Daniel Goleman's model. He has four quadrants of emotional intelligence. So the first is self-awareness. So all the ways in which we can develop more awareness about kind of what makes us tick and have more awareness around all of our own habitual patterns and hot buttons, emotional triggers, and the unconscious core beliefs that drive a lot of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and a lot of negative limiting core beliefs. And the more we become aware of all that in an empathic way, we develop greater self-understanding and self-empathy. And that naturally leads to greater ability to self-manage, which is the second quadrant, emotion regulation, self-management. And we can learn lots of skills for that, breath regulation techniques and meditation. If you're angry, count to 10 before you do anything, all kinds of state shifting techniques to way to better regulate our own emotions and our own behaviors. So that's the second quadrant. And then the third is social awareness or environmental awareness. So, that's extending that same self-awareness outward and developing, an empathic connection with others and the ability to really sense into what other people are feeling and needing. And then since we're getting better and more accurate data about the world around us, we're just naturally more skillful with people. And that's the fourth quadrant, which is, skillful communication, relationship management. And then, of course, you can practice all kinds of skills there, all the different models of communication and mediation and all that. So, and they're all self-reinforcing. So it's a pretty easy model for people to understand. And it's very mainstream out in the world of leadership and so forth. So that's fairly easy to introduce. And it's also pretty easy for people to understand how mindfulness or meditation or mindfulness training it just fits with emotional intelligence like a glove, because how do you become self-aware? Well, you pay attention to yourself, right?
Mhm.
you know, and uh, and how do you become more socially aware? By being awake and present and paying attention, right? So there's the model we call mindfulness-based emotional intelligence that we bring into, we didn't start with correctional officers. We started, I started another organization I started while I was in prison. Prison Dharma Network was about supporting prisoners interested in Buddhism and meditation. And eventually we developed a secular version of that called Prison Mindfulness Institute, which is wanting to get, secular evidence-based mindfulness interventions into the whole criminal justice world for at-risk, incarcerated, and returning youth and adults. And so that organization is a thriving organization. I started in my prison cell in 1989. Today, it's a thriving organization with members around the world, and we have programs in prisons all over the U.S. and many internationally as well. And so we were doing that work for 10 years before I got out of prison, and then I got out of the first 10 years after I got out, we are still mostly working with prisoners. Then eventually, we always wanted to work with the COs too. And eventually we got the opportunity to start working with correctional officers. And today, I'm working with police and probation and parole. I've done work with U.S. Border Patrol. And, those folks are really suffering. They're incredibly high stress jobs where they experience chronic stress and constant primary and secondary trauma exposure. And the health statistics for correctional officers that work in medium to high security facilities, really kind of on the tier with inmates, for 20 years or more, have a life expectancy of about 59 years, which is 2 decades less than the general population.
Hmm.
They're dying of suicide, and they're dying of all the chronic stress related ailments, and they're prone to alcoholism and all kinds of addictions and domestic violence and all kinds, because they're working in a state of hypervigilance all the time, and in a very unhealthy way. So in many ways that field is awakening to how self-destructive the way they've been approaching their jobs is, and they're really open. They're soaking it up like a sponge. And of course what happened, after the George Floyd tragedy and this whole kind of defund the police thing and all this social unrest, police departments are really looking for help. So there's an interest now in learning to do their job in different ways.
I love it. I love what you're doing. I think it's very interesting how you go from an inmate to building an institution that are helping um, patrol officers and helping with people inside the system and helping them gain some more awareness and mindfulness tips and helping them, because I agree with you. I think the stress related I guess like cancer and anxiety and everything like that is all induced by stress and our bodies, like living in that fight or flight response all the time like
Hmm.
they are, can do damage, terrible damage to our bodies. And being able to recognize that and putting in mindful meditation practices in our lives to help kind of reduce those fight or flight responses can reduce significantly um, uh, different type of illness. And I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's great. And it's just kind of cool that it started out in your prison cell all those years ago and now it's turned into what it is today. What like how did that idea come up? Like what was the aha moment for that?
Well, actually, I started doing some writing when I was in prison, and managed to get some of my writing. And I was writing about the life of a Buddhist prisoner, right? What was it like to try to practice meditation in prison and follow my Buddhist path in prison? And I managed to get writing published in some of the journals, like uh, one that was called the Shambhala Sun. It's now called Lion's Roar, and Tricycle Magazine, and some of the others. And so I was, people knew about me a little bit, and prisoners were starting to reach out for prisoners were getting interested in meditation and Buddhism, and they were reaching out to various meditation centers around the country. And most of these centers didn't have a clue what to do or how to, because, Christian prison ministry is very well developed, but Buddhist prison ministry was almost non-existent. And so they started sending letters to me and thinking, well, we don't know what to do with it. And so I started corresponding with some prisoners. I couldn't correspond with other federal prisoners. That was definitely not allowed. I wasn't able to do that. But I kind of got away with corresponding with other prisoners who were in state prisons or county jails. It was kind of a gray area, but they didn't stop me, so I just kept doing it. And so I'd get a letter from a prisoner and read it. And I worked in the education department as a school teacher, and they had the kind of the printing press for the prison was there, part of the education department. And so I could bring one of the magazines down there and get an article on meditation copied. So I'd do that and fold it up and write a note and put it in a letter and mail it off to this prisoner. And I'd be putting that together and I'd be kind of in a state of bliss. And I remembered reading Joseph Campbell's work, follow your bliss. And I thought, well, maybe I'm meant to stuff envelopes, this, but it was joyful because I realized, when you're in prison, getting a letter, I mean, when you go to mail call every day, and junk mail is better than no mail, it's like, you get no mail. It's like nobody loves me today, right? And I knew they'd get this letter, and they'd get they'd be very happy to get this and get this information about how to start meditating. So I was doing that, but I very quickly realized the need was much bigger than anything I could do on my own. So I started doing some research and figuring out how to start a nonprofit organization. And then there was a Nepalese guy in the prison who was coming to the meditation group that I started, and his brother was in another prison, and his brother had a girlfriend on the outside. And so they put us all in touch. And the girlfriend agreed to kind of be my mail drop. So I would mail stuff to her and she would mail it to the IRS, to get the nonprofit approved. And then, I reached out to some friends on the outside, raised $1,000, $1,500, and we were able to get this nonprofit going. And I was just connecting um, through her. She was doing the work, and I was kind of directing it, and we were connecting outside Buddhist teachers and even just students with a mature practice to become correspondents with prisoners, and then also getting people to donate books and sending books to prisoners. And she did it for a couple of years and then burned out. And then a close friend of mine who worked at a major publisher, Maull Publications, he took it on and he coordinated it for the next I guess I don't know 10 years or something until I got out. And then I when I got out I released to Boulder, Colorado, and started it up again. And then it really began taking off. Then it was a very small little volunteer operation, with a budget of 4 or 5 thousand a year at that point. But today it's a very very robust
Mm.
organization, and it's just built up over the last 22 years.
Did you get your PhD after prison or during when you were in it?
Well, both. I had a master's degree when I went in, and at one point I wanted to see if I could get my doctorate, and I actually got approved to do my doctorate through the Union Institute, which I would have if that had gone through, I would have gotten it while I was in prison because it was a time limited 2-year program, and the Union Institute has it's semi-residential and you have to go place and you go there with other learners, but they do that all around the place. So they were going to do a group in the prison for me, bring outside people come in and do that part with me. But then the warden didn't approve it.
Mm,
He thought it was too much hassle for program for
sure.
one prisoner. And so I kept searching and I ended up doing it through another university that didn't have that residential requirement. And I did all the coursework while I was in prison. And I submitted my dissertation proposal and got that approved. But then I got out and got busy and never got back to it. And then I had to get reinstated and still didn't get back to it. I got reinstated again, still didn't get it done. And then I went to get reinstated a third time, and they said, "That's okay. That's it. We're going to give you a deadline." I remember it was like May 18th of 20, I guess it was 2018 or 2019. I don't remember. And you got to get it done or you're done. And so I started all over with a whole new dissertation because what I've been doing before was no longer relevant. And I would have to have redone all the research anyway. So I finally got it. I finally got it done in either 2018 or 2019. And
Wow.
yeah, so it was part in, part out.
What was your dissertation on?
It was actually on the work of correctional officers. So it was called um, toward the development of a structured intervention for enhancing wellness and resiliency in correctional officers.
Wow, that is an
It was
intense.
basically designing a mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency program for correctional officers out of the existing psychosocial and neurobiological research on mindfulness, on well-being, and on resilience,
How
and
many
on correctional
how
officer
many
health.
pages was that?
It's 160 or something like that.
I cannot. That's just amazing. So I'm going back to school. Psychology is my minor, business is my major, but I want to get my PhD in psychology. I don't know what yet. Maybe transpersonal. I don't know. But I just did my first research paper on praising what is it, adult praise on children,
Hmm.
and it was just a short research paper, but 100 and some pages. Like mine wasn't that long. It was maybe like I don't know 15 pages, but it was all research. Much respect to you. Like 100 and some pages of a dissertation takes a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of time. I'm sure you had over 100 sources. Um, wow, that's amazing. I mean, your story is truly amazing, and I can't thank you enough for coming on this show.
Well, it's my pleasure, Trey. I'm happy to be here and happy to connect with your audience.
Yeah. How can people get a hold of you and find your book?
Well, the book is, you can find that at radicalresponsibilitybook.com. radicalresponsibilitybook.com, and you can read all about there and see all the accolades from people like Daniel Goleman, the founder of the author of Emotional Intelligence. And you can get a free chapter right there in the book, a free first chapter right there on that website. So radicalresponsibilitybook.com. And then my main website is just fleetmall.com, pretty easy to remember. And if people are interested in my courses, I have an institute called Heart Mind Institute. So it's heartmindinstitute.co, not com, but co. So www.heartmindinstitute.co. And then if they want to learn about the prison work, it's prisonmindfulness.org.
Awesome. Dr. Maull, thank you so much for joining. This has truly been a pleasure. I can't wait to follow your story and read the book, Radical Responsibility. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Trey.
And